It gives me great pleasure to introduce my colleague at Swansea University. Dr. Roberta Magnani is a senior lecturer in medieval English literature at Swansea. She specialises in late medieval literature, and in particular the works of Geoffrey Chaucer and the manuscripts in which his works circulated. She's particularly interested in creating a fruitful dialogue between past and present. And she does so by applying gender theory, by queer theory, especially queer theory, to her research into the medieval past. She also has a professional as well as a personal commitment to equality, diversity, and inclusivity. And she's an extremely valued member of the Equality, Diversity and Inclusion team at Swansea as a college lead. She's also director of GenCAS, which is the Centre for Research into Gender and Culture in Society at Swansea, and vice president of the International Scholarly Society for Medieval Feminist Scholarship. And her talk today on medieval transgender saints stems from both her academic and civic commitment to queer histories. That is, histories of reclamation of voices that have been traditionally wiped off the record. So I will hand over now to Roberta. There you go, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Kirsty. Thank you very much. And thank you everybody for attending. I would like to begin with a heartfelt expression of gratitude. And this is not one of those niceties that academics exchange at conferences, but it is very much a tribute that feels ever so important and apt in framing my talk today. I would like, first of all, to thank Swansea University's Cultural Institute, and especially the formidable and indefatigable and inspirational Dr. Elaine Canning for creative and exclusive and fostering an exciting cultural environment that provides a light of hope, reflection, and solace in these dark months marked by a global pandemic. Especially, I would like to thank the Institute for keeping the community at the center of its activities. And this will become apparent during my talk that this is particularly important to me. My vision of academia is one whereby our mission is much impoverished if we don't engage with what matters to society, especially to those voices in society who have consistently been silenced by the way we make history. In the same vein, I would like to thank Professor Kirsty Bohata and Dr. Owen Price for inviting me to speak tonight as part of the Inspire initiative, Wales and the World, that puts us as historians of the past in fruitful dialogue, I hope so in my case, with our now, which is everybody's now, not just academia's now. The title of my talk tonight is a quotation, another tribute. There will be quite a few tributes in my talk, to my extraordinary community of trans, non-binary, genderqueer fellow medievalists. Every year in May, scholars of the Middle Ages, broadly defined, as you know, as the period from late antiquity to the 16th century, gather in a curiously named city in Michigan in the US. This place is called Kalamazoo, which doesn't sound very medieval at all, especially to an Italian like me, but it is a pretty extraordinary place. However, in 2020, for obvious reasons, the conference was cancelled. Despite this, a group of colleagues gathered virtually to contribute to a roundtable entitled Transgender Roundtable on the Pardoner. This roundtable focused on one of the pilgrims or characters taking part in Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. And specifically, the panel was interested in the tale that the Pardoner tells as part of the wider narrative, frame narrative of the Canterbury Tales. The Pardoner was a somewhat corrupt religious figure, and this is the understatement of the century because he was a really dodgy character. He was selling pardons or free passes to heaven for many. His controversial portrait is enhanced by his transgressive sexuality and gender identity. The text is very vague, it's very elusive about the pardoner's sexual orientation. All we know is that he doesn't sit comfortably in the binary of femininity and masculinity. So the gender assigned to him, or even more appropriate thing to them at birth, which is male, appears to be inadequate to convey their identified gender. This is a concept and an embodied experience to which I shall return: identified gender, gender assigned at birth. The pardoner tells a tale that resonates with our current predicament. And this is very much what the roundtable at Virtual Kalamazoo talked about. So his tale is about the trauma caused by the Black Death or the bubonic plague, a medieval global pandemic, a medieval COVID-19. And in particular, the Black Death affecting a great part of Europe in 1348 occurred just a few years before Chaucer started writing the Canterbury Tales. So the Canterbury Tales is a post-apocalyptic text, a text that tries to make sense of a society that is trying to coming out of a global pandemic and trying to work out a new normal. So it is a tale about how to defeat death before we had vaccinations, about how to banish a global pandemic, how to free ourselves from the specter of impending doom as a constant reminder of our fragility and our mortality. As we may expect, the attempt to kill death fails, as the characters get tempted and distracted by gold, so by economic imperatives, by the economy. So in this tale, wealth trumps health. And I think that it rings a bell for all of us. The now Chaucer touches and chimes powerfully with our now. The underpinnings of what is normal, real, safe are irretrievably exploded and shaken up by a global pandemic in the medieval now and in our now. The panel at Kalamazoo called this predicament, and I quote, a trans state of mind. And this is where the title of my talk comes from. Sarah Hamed, an academic, activist, and queer theorist, talks about her experience of being a lesbian, again, of the experience of transgressing societal gender norms. And I quote, this is how she defines it, as becoming reoriented, as the disorientation of encountering the world differently. And I think we can all share in this disorientation, especially in the last 10 months. My argument is here, and it was also the panel's argument, that non-binary trans identities can offer a model to understand our current predicament, the overturning of everything we knew as normal as real. My question is, and perhaps this is a prompt for reflective writing and perhaps for the workshop that will follow my talk, or reflections that my talk and things that we will be discussing may prompt. So my question is, can we all see ourselves in these trans experiences, in these narratives, in these states of mind? Aren't we all in a trans state of mind, including individuals like myself, identified as cis, that is, those on the side of or aligned to the gender assigned to them at birth? If the Latin prefix trans means crossing over, aren't we all crossing over somehow? And this is what I'm about to say is very important to me. Of course, transness and identifying as trans is an embodied experience that I absolutely do not wish to co-opt or misappropriate for self-serving purposes. But as an ally, my commitment is to amplify those voices marginalized and often erased, violently erased by our historical accounts. My commitment is to reposition transness as central to our understanding of ourselves, of processes of identity formation, and yes, also to our historical moment. So for me, transness is not something that happens at the margins of society, but especially in our cultural current moment, it's at the very center of it. I advocate for a trans epistemology and hermeneutics that is a trans way of making sense of the world. I am committed to trans history as an ally, as a friend. And as a white cis woman, with all the biases, forms of entitlement, privileges that this entails, and that I hope I will always remain aware of and wary of, but I want to use my privilege, I want to use my position to amplify these stories. Blake Gutt and Alicia Spencer Hall, two medievalists who have just edited a book on trans and genderqueer medieval saints, define trans history as, and I quote, an ongoing project of reclamation. History needs rewriting. It needs concerted processes of revision in order to stop trans lives from being wiped off ever again. Trans history is a crossover in time and space, and our reflection tonight on medieval trans saints is intended to contribute to a project of representation so that trans individuals can now find themselves in these narratives, so that they can find their history, their queer genealogy. How can we be what we can't see? Carolyn Dinshaw, a medievalist and queer theorist, has advocated for a queer touch across time and space and boundaries of various kinds. An intellectual and ethical commitment to build capacious and inclusive communities where voices can be found and heard, a trans kinship, a belonging. And this is what my talk is hoping to do, to facilitate a queer touch between the medieval now and our now. And I would like to do so by introducing you to a medieval transgender saint in the hope to offer a space of recuperation and identification, both past and present. There were so many medieval trans saints that I really wanted to discuss with you. And in particular, Saint Wilgefortis is the one that I really wanted to discuss with you, also known as the bearded saint. But I focused on Saint Eugenia for various reasons. And later on, if in the chat you would like to hear a little bit more about this, I'm very happy to do so. Also, I wanted to share the work of a colleague, Rachel Moss, who has recently given an excellent plenary talk on Wilgefortis. But the bearded saint will have to wait for another occasion. So on to Saint Eugenia. Although later I will switch to naming her Saint Eugenius for reasons that hopefully will become apparent. Eugenia was a highborn, beautiful and holy maiden who lived in Egypt with her family, as her father was the Roman prefect of Alexandria. Although the version of her life, or also known as hagiography, to which I will refer, is in an Old English translation penned by the Bishop Elfrich, who lived roughly between 955 and 1020, Eugenia lived in late antiquity, in the first centuries after the death of Christ, when Christians were still subjected to persecutions. I would like to stop here for a second, because at the end of my talk, I will return to this. Although Saint Eugenia lived in late antiquity, centuries later, in the 9th, 10th century, but also much later on in the Middle Ages, saints remained key cultural figures. They were the celebrities of the Middle Ages. Everybody knew about them, everybody read about them. Hagiographies circulated in all vernacular languages, in Latin. So later on, I will return to this. There is a real sense of the exceptional quality of these individuals. But much like other martyr saints, Eugenia dies, sorry about the massive spoiler here, in defense of her faith and as a result of being persecuted by pagans. Her death was violent and cruel. Eugenia was also highly educated, and this is really important, I think, in terms of her gendering, conversant with Greek philosophy and Latin rhetoric. Her erudition brought her to God, to whom she decided to dedicate her life, the prospect of which gave her much joy, a profound euphoria. And I'm going to quote briefly from the text, the translation from Old English, to the moment in the text that depicts her encounter with the divine, with the Christian God. Rapidly, Eugenia journeyed until she came to where the Christians were singing with great joy. I really like this scene, and the text goes on depicting the Christians singing together, a community, a joyful, euphoric community, where Eugenia finds her authentic self. She finds her vocations, she finds her calling, she finds her identity. Euphoria is a term, and I'm using here purposefully, also used by scholars engaging with queer identities, as they describe the extraordinary joyful experience of self-determination and self-affirmation that trans or genderqueer individuals enjoy as they extricate themselves from the constraints of the gender assigned to them as birth, and can signify finally either socially or medically or privately as the gender they identify with. As Alice Light, a fellow medievalist, puts it beautifully, and I will forever be grateful to Alice for this wonderful phrase, gender euphoria is, and I quote, the fully embodied comfort and joy in oneself. Isn't this just wonderful? Eugenia is holy because she is, and I quote from Gutt and Spencer Hall here, she's an image of radical authenticity. She's authentic vis-a-vis her faith, despite pagan threats to her virginity and spirituality, but she's also authentic to the gender she identifies with. And this is where I shall stop referring to Eugenia as Eugenia, and which is female coded, and I will switch to Eugenius, which is male coded, and I'll stop using female pronouns and I will use male pronouns from now on. In fact, he seeks the help of two brothers in the Christian faith and asks them to transform him into a man. He wants to worship God as a man, and this is how the text describes this moment, again in translation. Eugenia took them aside to speak privately. She called them brothers. I really like this moment in which he forms his community of brothers. He finds his, as in queer theory, in theory terms, we would say his queer familia, his queer family, and asked them to cut off her hair in custom of males. So I will return to this phrase, in custom of males, in a moment, so bear that in mind. And through garments, pretend she was a young man because she did not want to be revealed. She wanted to draw near the Christian in a masculine guise. As self-identification is key to trans identities, and although the text does not allow us an insight into Eugenius' specific gender identification, we never hear Eugenius' voice, we never hear him identifying as a specific gender, because his voice is ventriloquized, is spoken by the narrator. But despite that, and applying a trans now to his past, and I know that there are always questions, and important questions, about applying contemporary theory to the past, but this is where the queer touch comes into play. And this is where it's also, with all the caveats and with all the attention and careful handling of these terms, also it's worth taking the risk to put these trans histories in place. So by applying a trans now to his past, may liberate him from the trappings of the gender binary and the prescripted social norms that he clearly seeks to escape. In particular, and I follow here a very useful guide to gender terminology authored by Spencer Hall and Gutt, a trans woman or a trans man, spelled as one word, are individuals assigned male and female at birth. And as you know, these are often abbreviated as AMAB, so an individual assigned male at birth, or AFAB, an individual assigned female at birth, whose identified gender does not match their assigned gender, regardless of whether they have medically or socially transitioned. Here, Eugenius expresses his will to socially transition as he puts in place steps to establish his identified gender. So clothing, hairstyle can all function as technologies of self-expression, a gender-affirming strategy. However, as you can see, the text and its narrator resist all trans possibilities and qualify Eugenius's transitioning as cross-dressing, that is, as a disguise and a masquerade. I'm not for one moment arguing that cross-dressing is not a valid gender position or subject position, quite the opposite. But what I'm arguing here, and this is alongside a longer tradition of scholarly criticism, is that perhaps in this case, cross-dressing, so the wearing of clothes that are traditionally associated with a gender which is not the one that we were assigned at birth, may be slightly limiting of if it's only about impersonation, if it's only about wearing clothes, limiting of Eugenius's experience here and self-identification. The text keeps dead naming Eugenius by reducing his identified gender to an expedient concealment of a true identity, which the text always keeps as femininity. The use of personal pronoun is also indicative of dead naming, so of employing the name and gender a transgender or agender, genderqueer individual no longer uses. For the remainder of the narrative, Eugenius is dead named as Eugenia and misgendered as she. I would also like to point out that this is the Old English version. Other versions of the narrative, especially earlier ones, deal with Eugenius's gender in much more nuanced and sensitive ways. This culminates in the bishop erasing Eugenius's claim to authenticity and reversing his gender affirmative identification as a man, and not as any man, because as I said earlier, I was going to return to that idea of Eugenius wanting to identify as in the custom of males. In the Old English, males is the word that is translated as males is wepmona, and wepmona means weapon-bearing men. So this is a very specific type of medieval masculinity, early medieval military masculinity, a kind of weapon-bearing, almost a hyper-masculinity. And of course, the phallic implications of implicating weapons here are, I think, pretty obvious in the way in which Eugenius positions and identifies himself. So this is what the bishop does, and I think this is, for me, the most extraordinary example of mansplaining I've ever come across. So the bishop takes Eugenius to one side and says this to him. He took her aside, telling her that she was not truly a man, but was a maiden, whose virginity greatly pleased the Heavenly King she had chosen. Much like the bishop, the text forces femininity on Eugenius. These processes of straightening, silencing, dead naming, invalidation are pernicious and brutally violent. As he stands in trial, falsely accused of assaulting Melancia, a jolted temptress whose advances the virginal Eugenius has rejected, he is forced to reveal himself. In order to prove his innocence, he only has one choice: to return to the gender assigned to him at birth and which he has clearly rejected. So what he needs to do is to bare his chest to prove that he was assigned female at birth, because obviously this is the only way of proving in front of a judge, in front of a court, that he couldn't have possibly sexually assaulted Melancia. And what follows is a most violating scene in which Eugenius exposes his chest to prove that he was assigned a female at birth. And this is how the text describes this horrendous moment in the narrative. She tore open her clothes and revealed her breasts to the famous Philippus. She said to him, "You are my father, and your wife Claudia bore me to humankind." So language here, I think, is very important and very much enacting operations of violence on the body. So his chest is forcibly gendered as breasts, The verb to tear open signifies the sheer violence and the imposed self-violence of this gesture. The utter vulnerability of his exposed body is augmented by having to do this in front of his father, the prefect of the province, Philippus. The authority of the father, both political and legal, exemplifies the ways in which societal norms police and violate bodies, especially those bodies which signify queerly or in non-conforming manners. It is also a forced return to a family, a straight genealogy, a patriarchal system, which Eugenius had elected to abandon in favor of a different kinship, a community of his choice, that of his fellow monks, of whom he had then become the abbot, the leader. His authenticity as well as his authority are obliterated in the name of cultural norms and constructs which literally castrate him. And I'm here thinking of the transgender now. Where would transgender individuals find themselves in this narrative, in this medieval narrative? And where would people like me identifying as cisgender position themselves in this narrative? But in particular, how would transmasculine, non-binary or agender people who flatten their chest by binding in order to appear more normatively masculine see themselves in these narratives? How would they find their own trauma in Eugenius? Would they find their own trauma in Eugenius's imposed reveal? Would they find a space to grieve and mourn in this medieval text? But most importantly, amidst the suffering and beyond it, would they find an affirmative narrative charged with the potential for euphoria? The euphoria that comes with attaining and claiming at a great cost a safe space where one can fully rejoice in being oneself, one's authentic self, in finding a trans history which doesn't erase them, but casts them as holy, as exceptional, as revered, as long-lasting influencers. I shall leave you with a thought, perhaps a writing prompt. Earlier this week, my MA class discussed trans saints' lives in the medieval context. The wonderful Alicia Spencer Hall, whom I've already mentioned, joined us. This is perhaps one of the few silver linings of online teaching, that I can ask my colleagues and wonderful friends from around the world to join me and my students during our classes. At the end of the session, she tweeted about it, and I added a tweet to hers, this addressed to our colleague, Dr. Gabrielle M.W. Bajkowski, whose work on medieval trans identity is nothing short of groundbreaking and whose advocacy is nothing short of heroic. And I said to Gabby that she must have had her ears ringing throughout the session, as we mentioned her so often. I still have goosebumps at her reply and her response, so forgive me for this. But this is what she replied, and she said, "My ears ring every time a trans saint gets their wings." I love this idea that in my MA class we may have done that. So this is my wish for a trans medieval now, as it touches our trans now, a time that encompasses us all, as I tried to argue at the beginning of the talk. My wish is that voices who have been and are still white off the record, dismissed, invalidated, brutally erased, are being instead reclaimed, heard, made visible, and euphorically celebrated with a full set of wings. Thank you.